Stefan Fatsis. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Talia. I'm so happy to be talking with you.
I am so happy to have you here because your book, Unabridged, The Thrill and Threat to the Modern Dictionary, is coming out in October. Tell us, Stefan, what's going on?
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. This is my second word book. A long time ago, I wrote a book called Word Freak about the subculture of competitive Scrabble. And about a decade ago, I sort of got into Merriam-Webster's project to revise the unabridged dictionary, Webster's Third, which hadn't been updated since 1961. And Merriam had this grand vision for this like multi-decade, A to Z revision of this classic dictionary. And I wrote a piece about that for Slate, like a 10,000 word magazine piece for Slate when it was happening. And then after I wrote the piece, I approached Merriam, publisher John Morris, and I said, I'd really like to do more on this. I'd like to do a book. But if I do a book, I would want to embed, I would want to become a lexicographer so I can write this from the inside.
And that's what you did. So, yeah, like walk us through that. You have written a lot on sports journalism, or I guess you are known as something of a sports journalist,
Mhm.
but you are a word freak and you wrote the book Word Freak. And we met at a linguistics conference, and I would consider you an honorary linguist.
Oh, thank you.
How does being kind of a journalist help you approach language differently? How do you see language differently from an academic, from a linguist?
I love that question. I mean, I think that the job of any journalist is to translate worlds for the general public. When I had the idea to do a book about the subculture of competitive Scrabble, I got a lot of sort of eye rolls from people like, what? Scrabble? A book? Didn't make any sense. But what I discovered is that, like, look, if you can penetrate any interesting world and find a way to universalize it or to humanize it, to tell a broader story about something that reflects on our society in a more important way. That to me is like the most fun you could have as a journalist. Before I wrote Word Freak, I hadn't done any first person journalism. It was new to me. It was like, oh, I was always like a byline in the newspaper kind of reporter, leave yourself out of the story, just talk to other people, present objective, fair, honest, balanced, thorough writing and reporting. With Word Freak, I sort of got out of that shell and I realized that like the best way, like I really believe this now, to describe worlds, particularly worlds that aren't well understood or popular, is to get inside and do it. So, like the Scrabble, I became an expert player. It took me like 4 years, but I did it. And I tell that story in a narrative way in Word Freak. And then my next piece of immersive first person journalism, I went completely like off the board and decided I should play in the NFL. And I spent a year getting into shape and I persuaded an NFL team to let me go to training camp as a place kicker because I wanted to write about the National Football League, one of the most overcovered industries in America, but one that people really don't get. They don't really understand what's going on inside a locker room or on the sidelines. And I wanted to worm my way into an NFL team so that I could give the players the opportunity to tell their story from the inside and also experience it. And it wasn't that much different here. I mean, these are like vastly different worlds. But I really believe that, like, okay, I could write a story about Merriam revising a dictionary or about the state of the dictionary business. But to really sort of, again, to personalize and humanize it, to give the reader something to hang on to, like me, I needed to go do it. I needed to try to write definitions and become a quasi amateur linguist.
And you did. And we met at a linguistics conference, and you very much felt like you were part of the culture and part of the vibe and like knew what was going on. I want to turn to like the thesis of this book, which is the thrill and the threat to the thrill of the dictionary, the threat to the modern dictionary. You talk a lot about the dictionary in these kind of like economic terms, and you frame language in very economic terms. You talk about words as currency, and you talk about it's kind of the book sort of ends in this place where maybe the dictionary is like coming to an end or evolving out of the form that it once was. And so I'm very curious about that, but also kind of how do you, where does the dictionary go from here? Because you seem to argue, at least at the end of this book, that it's like different now,
It is
fundamentally.
it is
Yeah.
different now. I mean, and dictionaries are no different than any other medium, any other sort of um, communications business, really. I mean, it's a really modern phenomenon or modern product. The dictionary, as we conceive of it, a book with words in alphabetical order, with headwords and other types of information next to them. This is only about 400 and something years old, which is not that long given the sort of arc of human history. So the dictionary has always kind of evolved from shorter lists, more specific lists of words that were used mostly by academics or specialists, um, to what we think of as the modern lexicon, which really does sort of start with Samuel Johnson and Noah Webster and is refined by the Merriam brothers in the 1840s and beyond. I mean, the first dictionary that really feels like what we think of as a modern book was Merriam's 1864 dictionary. It was looked much more like a dictionary. The way that the entries were crafted, the typography, all of it sort of feels like, oh, there's not that much difference in the last 150 years. So the change we're going through now, where print is all but dead. I mean, it's really like a backlist phenomenon for Merriam and Oxford and other, the few remaining dictionary publishers. We have transitioned into a completely online realm. I mean, so much so that what we've seen in the last 30 years has been a diminishment in the ability of American dictionary publishers to survive. I mean, there's basically one traditional dictionary publisher left in America, and that is Merriam-Webster. Dictionary.com would be the only other sort of active dictionary that has some lexicographers, definers on staff. Oxford's a different story. It is sort of it's a loss leader for the university that will be funded in perpetuity, though it's a huge business that has lots of tentacles in publishing and other fields. But the what I see is the thrill is that words don't change, right? We still are enamored with them. Word generation, creation, propagation has never been like it is now. And then the threat is like, what's going to happen? Not just that print is dead, but that AI is threatening the model of creating dictionaries, and that Google has already siphoned so much traffic to traditional dictionary sites. So this is a gigantic period of transition in what in America in particular has been a very competitive dictionary business.
Great. So at one point, towards the end of the book, you actually talk about this lack of competition for Merriam. And
Right.
not only do you say that's bad for Merriam-Webster, which just like basically, I mean, that's pretty basic fundamental economic argument. That's not that controversial. But then you want to say that's not good for American English either.
Yeah. I mean,
Why would, yeah,
I believe that's the case. I think competition helps all industries, and maybe that's a capitalistic way of looking at business or looking at language. But that's the tradition in the United States. And the risk is that, if there's one dictionary publisher left in an environment where defining words and releasing new lists of entries into a dictionary isn't as much of a priority because there's really nobody there to sort of say, hey, we've got a better source. We've got a more robust word list. Hey, look at these 10,000 words that we're adding to the dictionary. Without that, there is a risk of complacency because people are still going to go to merriam-webster.com and look up words. It's going to be harder because it is harder because of Google, because of knowledge boxes at the top of search pages, because of AI at the top of search pages. But people are still going to use the online dictionary because, hey, it's in my pocket. I can use the app. I need to look up a word right now. It's a fast, easy way to do it. But if there isn't an imperative to be better, well, where is Merriam driving most of its traffic these days? Yeah, it's from lookups, but the way you get people to stay on a page, if you're a media company, is to do things like have games and have blog posts and have ancillary content that isn't actually word definitions entries.
yeah. And you even compare them to the New York Times. Does the New York Times sort of devolving into a place with recipes and games that also happens to have news. And
Yes,
in fact, that's actually how they market themselves now. If you get an ad for the New York Times, they have, real people talking about how it's so easy to flip between my recipes and my games and my Wordle. And then I'm popping
totally.
over to Ezra Klein. He's sort of just in the background and like, am I really listening? So,
Exactly. And,
yeah,
and I don't think it's much different. I mean, Merriam just announced a few weeks before we're talking that they were adding more games, developed, either internally or acquired by its parent company, Encyclopedia Britannica. I mean, they're approaching like, 10 or so independent games on their website, distinct games on the website, including a crossword puzzle, including a bunch of Wordle knockoffs. So there is this need, this imperative from a business perspective to do things that will get people to come to your website and stay. So it's like, hey, play Wordle and maybe look up a word while you're there. Or play Wordle and maybe you'll be reminded that, oh, yeah, they've got a thesaurus. That's kind of cool. And you'll come back when you're writing something and look something up. But, news, I mean, I don't want to minimize the desire on the part of users to go to dictionary websites because when stuff breaks in the news, I mean, we have been in like the craziest news cycle. I mean, all news cycles are crazy, but really the last 10 years, particularly the two Trump administrations, have been among the most lexically intense times of this and I don't know how many generations going back. I mean, if you think of like Trump and then you think of COVID and you think of like current Trump, the demand for sort of life or death information, objective, solid information, reality-based information that a dictionary like Merriam-Webster provides is critical to the functioning of democracy and a civil society.
that's a strong claim.
It is a strong claim because I think it's true. I mean, as Corey Stamper, former Merriam editor and author of the great memoir Word by Word, when I interviewed her, I did a piece during COVID about Merriam getting COVID into the dictionary, the word COVID into the dictionary in 34 days. Merriam never done anything like that. Right. For generations, it took like 6, 8, 10 years before words that were introduced into the language to find their way into Merriam's print dictionaries because of this belief that a word has to sort of solidify itself in language, demonstrate sustained usage over time in mainstream professionally edited publications. With COVID, you saw something that we haven't seen in human history. I mean, I talked to an editor at Oxford about this who said that it reminded her of World War I in terms of the intensity of the creation of language around sort of a catastrophe. And with COVID went from didn't exist to familiar to everybody in the world within the space of a few weeks. And Merriam's job, as Corey said to me, was literally a matter of life and death. People needed to find out like what, shelter in place meant or, what any of this multitude of terms that were swirling around in the public consciousness that were unknown of just a few weeks earlier. And, it matters to people to have that kind of information. And it matters when you're looking up fascism or insurrection or racism. I mean, all of these sort of hot button terms that have like permeated assassination that have permeated our culture in recent years. It is vital to have someplace to go where people can get authoritative understanding.
Totally. And I think that many people would argue that, like, in general, it's like the lack of trust in our institutions that's like blame for the like I don't know, imploding of democracy. But something I want to pick up on is that the idea that the last 10 years are sort of this really lexically intense, generative, propulsive time, particularly in the Trump administrations. You talk a lot in this book about the Word of the Year ceremonies, which is where we met at the Linguistic Society of America, American Dialect Society Word of the Year meeting every year, and how that kind of like the choosing of the word of the year matters so much. And you talk about bush lips as this lexical item that did not make it into our permanent lexicon. Like I had never really heard of it until I had read your book. But maybe it kind of starts with the fact that we have this example of bush having kind of like one word that sort of mattered, but then didn't matter. And how Trump has like, I don't even know, whatever number of words that totally matter. And we still think about bigly and covfefe and nasty woman and just like other kind of lexicalized phrases or words that he's come up with. Um, what's going on there? There's the inherent connection between language and politics and words and political movements, but also this like incredibly lexically intense generative time.
I think what's going on there is just we have this public figure who is at once buffoonish and powerful. And in the first Trump administration, that um, that was sort of exemplified by his malapropisms, his and these other words that were became associated with him because of his constant repetition of certain words and phrases in his sort of fourth grade level um, dialogue. So someone who is sort of on the one hand this enormously important and powerful person is also has this clownish side that comes through in his language. I think was something that just sort of became this really had this intensifying effect on people's observations of language or people's attention to language. I mean, don't forget, during that first Trump administration, that's when Merriam-Webster's Twitter feed became this really irreverent, pushbacky, sassy place. And that was all very deliberate. And what Trump was this sort of rising tide that lifts all boats, as I write in the book. And that included language. It was an opportunity for the Twitter account to play with his abuse of language, whether it's like tic tacs or grabbing or any of these other awful things that have sort of been imprinted on our brains about his behavior and his words. I mean, when you have that kind of overwhelming attention, like the attention economy on Trump is so high and has remained high for a decade. You're gonna have these moments of intensity that come out with, Merriam's like lists of the most looked up words, or the word of the year vote, where a bunch of Trumpisms dominate the
Dominate
conversation.
completely. Yeah.
Dominate. And they did for several years.
And they still probably will. Like, I'm guessing the
Absolutely.
next few Word of the Year votes will be dominated by Trumpisms.
Totally.
I mean, insurrection, I think, was the Word of the Year for 2021. Like, these things matter. And then, of course, it's, sort of fitting that the words of the year that are chosen that don't actually end up having a very long shelf life didn't really have much to do with Trump himself. So, I mean, inshitification sort of is still around, kind of, but that was somewhat connected to Trump. But see, again, we hate that. I hate that. But that, I mean, no one's using it, and isn't that great? And it's not great for me. Yeah. Anyway, but I do want to kind of, so on page 218, because I'm writing down page numbers, I just want to quote this because you say to lexicographers, words are like abstract expressionist paintings, complicated and demanding of quiet contemplation and analysis. Their power lies in their existence, not their deployment. To others, though, words are armaments in an endless war, and the dictionary is the manufacturer. 200 years of marketing have pushed that idea. The American dictionary is influencer, authority, power. If you don't like a word, you know who to blame.
Yeah, I
Fascinating
like
to me.
that phrase. Thank you.
Yeah.
Lexicographers don't care, right? I mean, the one thing that I really learned is that words are abstractions. They are something to be studied. They are something to be parsed. Um, Definers spend hours trying to unlock the the sort of hidden meanings in a string of letters and then find the words to simplify them so that they are understandable to anybody. No judgment, no politics, no nothing. You really do have to leave your politics aside. And that's no different than being a reporter, or at least a good one. It can be hard, and it's harder and arguably debatable as to whether how healthy that is today, given what's going on in the country. But the idea that these are like abstractions, these you have to just sort of be as dispassionate as possible. about each and every word. That's kind of a grounding principle for lexicography. And and it is one of the things I think that makes it so important and so artful that there are people that can do that, that can like shut themselves off from the tumult in culture that is producing these words and producing new meanings, and just find the historical, the sort of the chronology, the evolution of the way meanings evolve. And we've seen that, in some of the more poisonous ways, right? The way words are twisted and weaponized. When you think of words like woke or cancel, or DEI, liberal, go back even farther, like Black Power wasn't a pejorative when it was coined in the African American community, but it was adopted as a sort of weapon against Black communities. This is a recurring theme in American political and cultural life. And what the lexicographer has to do is sort of step back and just look at it and see how words evolve. I mean, a couple of the words that I defined early on, this goes back to the mid-late 2010s. I mean, I ended up defining alt-right, which surged in popularity and has sort of faded a little bit in terms of its potency because of the dominance of the right-wing establishment. Alt-right is now just republicanism. Microaggression, I also defined another word that kind of ends up being a pejoration, right? Turned back on the community that created it or the community that it refers to. And the lexicographer has to constantly be ready to update words as the meanings change. And that's what Merriam is really, really good at. The way that lexicographers like Emily Brewster and others on staff at Merriam keep an eye on words as their meanings evolve in these sensitive times is essential to making sure that, when someone types in racism into the search bar on Merriam, they're going to get a contemporary explanation of the term.
Hmm. And you talk a lot about, yeah, methods and the methods that lexicographers use to define words and figure out their meanings. And you went through hundreds and hundreds, I imagine, of archives when you were writing this book, thinking about past words of the year, and then also when you were actually working as a lexicographer to define words. But at one point, you talk about the science, like sort of the way that, well, I guess I'm going to call it the scientification of
Mhm.
lexicography, but the way that there just is kind of this emerging systematic way that we choose what the word of the year is, or we choose what the definition of the word is. Um, you know, I am quoted in the book, spoiler alert,
Yes, you
on
are.
page 107. I'm there.
You are
Uh,
page 107.
I am page 107.
You are the
Speaking,
star of page
oh, well,
107, I'm
thank
going to
you.
say.
Yes, what can I say? It's just calling to me. I knew it from the second I thought of page 107. I'm quoted defending Cunty, and I will defend that to this day. And I'm glad that you got I'm glad that you also quoted people that disagreed with me about Cunty. But that's kind of another example of a word that was not chosen for the category that it was being nominated for, but still lives on, and I think that's great. So, talk a little about methodologies, and then also, kind of like how the discourse around what should be word of the year or isn't is often antithetical to like actually what's going on with the word, because ultimately the people, right, again, it's this tension between the
Right.
people, the users of language, and the establishment who decide what this word means. But there's so much tension between like who decides what the word means, but then also like can you use it, can you not, and really it's in our hands.
Yeah, I mean, I think Word of the Year, and it's sort of like I think the history of Word of the Year is probably like a book in itself.
Totally.
This was originated in the early 1990s by a professor, a linguist who, looked at Time magazine and its Person of the Year and thought, hey, we should do that at our conference, once a year. We should pick a Word of the Year, not just a Person of the Year. And the science of it didn't really emerge until the commercial publishers started getting into the act. Um, Word of the Year always, as done by the American Dialect Society, was always perceived as this sort of fun moment, where a bunch of word nerds, academics, a few reporters, some members of the general public could get together and sort of laugh and make nominations and support and defend words. And then in the end, you'll spit out something that may or may not have been the reflective of the zeitgeist and may or may not have any lasting power, but that's not the job of Word of the Year. I mean, that's the job of lexicographers, right? Like to determine whether and shitification should be enshrined in a dictionary. For the Word of the Year voters, it's like, oh my God, it's fun to say in shitification, or it's fun to say cunty, or it's fun to say whatever.
Raw
Um,
dog.
yeah,
Raw
raw
dog recent
dog,
word of the year,
Word of the Year
which
winner. That's
totally like is gonna have a shelf life. And I think
totally
that it's I mean, someone on social media compared it to suck in that like we don't actually think of like a lot of people don't really
yeah.
even think of raw dog in terms of it like where it actually comes from. You can kind of it's like a really, really flexible term that like you
Right.
can use in any situation. Yeah.
Right. I think I saw somebody, I think I saw a skeet or some comment somewhere, someone saying, like, I heard my 13-year-old say raw dog completely, without any
Not
understanding of
understanding.
what it
Yeah,
meant.
right.
Right. And that's where words come from. And I think I used the suck example in unabridged in like a footnote about raw dogging and how it won. I mean, it is a word that like suck did not start as this sort of benign word that, it wouldn't have probably been printed in the New York Times when I was a kid because it
Mm.
had a clear evolution. Like you knew where it came from. And then the meaning evolves over time, and suck is no more an obscenity than anything else now. But back to the methodology part, because that's sort of like the ADS part is like, and you'll hear people complain at ADS, people that have been coming for 20 or 30 years say that, oh, it's kind of like it's been taken over by politics. And when we started to allow the LSA people, the linguists to come in, and it wasn't just the lexicographers and dictionary adjacent folks, like the whole tenor of the room changed and the voting changed. But I think the bigger issue with words of the year is just sort of like how much range there is now. And I don't mean issue in a bad way, but now there's tremendous range. And with like Merriam and every other commercial dictionary publisher hopping on the word of the year bandwagon in the last 20 years, everyone sort of tried to sort of find a way to stand out. So it became like, oh, lookups for this particular word increased more than any other word. So that makes it the most important. Oh, or, this was the most important thing in the news. And therefore, this was the word that was most reflective of that news event. And therefore, that should be our word of the year. And in a way, I think it's kind of like, wow, there's like 20 words of the year. It's kind of funny and it's kind of interesting, but it also does allow the public who reads these stories and maybe will then go to Merriam.com or Oxford.com or some other dictionary publisher.com and look something up. The value there is that it reflects how much range society has, the way we continue to produce new words and new usages of words. It's just fun. And whether you think like the science behind word of the year is silly, because you're like trying to apply like, sabermetric principles to language. Or, and like there are people that say like sabermetrics destroying baseball and like they're being used in the wrong way now. And there's some value in stats and advanced stats, but it's hurt the game. You can make the same sort of argument, maybe a little silly, but you can make the same sort of argument that like, okay, this is kind of ridiculous now. And like whether a word's lookups have increased 8,000% is kind of immaterial. And that's why I kind of like the ADS's approach that even if it's flawed sometimes and words get selected that are not going to have any staying power and even leave like older people like me scratching their heads about some part of online culture that I just wasn't aware of. It's still to me like this sort of expansive, diverse, interesting platform for discussing language.
Thank you for that. Yeah. No, I guess like I would say that the scientification of everything is just interesting because, in some ways it's great because we're listening more. We're listening empirically. We're looking at how many lookups and how often was this word used and
Right.
go through corpora and look at tweets and whatever. But then on the other hand, then we don't listen so much because then we have people on the mic saying like this word is offensive or problematic. And divorcing that from the fact that people are using it in non-offensive, non-problematic ways.
Yes.
So that is like the like ever-present tension in that room, in that like people get on the mic and they say this is like deeply offensive, and it's like, well, where in the data? But then also like, why does the data need to be everything that we listen to? Um,
Or shouldn't we just be talking about how, regardless of its offense, it is something that has penetrated popular culture? Is it okay to have that conversation? And similarly, the perennial argument at Word of the Year votes over the origin of words.
Mm-hmm.
The year where woke became a candidate, a finalist, and was beaten by dumpster fire during the first Trump administration, or 2016, I guess. That was like, okay, the history of woke, which I get into in some detail in Unabridged in the book, is interesting. Is it disqualifying that a word emerged from AAVE and then was adopted by overwhelmingly white America and has become something that now has been twisted in a completely different way? I mean, does that make it less worthy, or is it more interesting, or is it just depressing, or is it all those things?
Right. And then also, I mean, not to bring it back again to Cunty, which I know, whatever, but
No,
I
no,
think
you
it
can
is a
bring it
good
back to Conte.
example.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
want to bring it back to Cunty
sure.
because, like, Cunty is not unique. Like, it went through semantic elevation. That's like exact, like, but, and they also, the other thing is, like, I am so happy and so, we need to recognize that Cunty originated within, like, drag and ballroom and Black communities. But
Hmm.
also, like, where did they get Cunty? From the C word. So, like,
Right.
to say that it's like somehow appropriation for people with vaginas to like use that word is kind of weird to me because I'm like, well, where did the people who like aren't cis women originally get that term from anyway? And then like also who's the cis woman that like made cunty sort of like of the vernacular again? Beyonce,
Beyonce.
like in her song, right? That was a great song, underrated album that didn't win album of the year. And you know who did win? A white man. So why aren't we talking about that? Anyway, but so like to bring it back to that, it's like yeah, we need to recognize where words originate, but the origination is not the current moment, right?
Right.
Like language changes. Yes.
Yes, and it's something that Emily Brewster at Merriam said to me during one of my first days when I was inside the building, and I was sort of marveling about like some totally benign new words. It might have been, what was it? It was like upcycle or something. It was like, wow, I've never seen that before. And it was like, oh, there's an old meeting. And like, oh, now there's a new meeting. And oh, this is also fascinating. And Emily said something like, they're all fascinating. It doesn't matter like what the word is. It doesn't matter if it's the worst word possible in English or if it's something that no one uses anymore. They are all interesting. And it is important for lexicographers and linguists to to unearth the history and the usage and the adaptation and the change. I mean, I know there are words for all of this in linguistics, and I'm not a linguist. I didn't major in linguistics. It's like there, this is all sort of currency for academic study, but it's also super relevant popularly. And I think that's the nexus for me of Word of the Year is that it does have that effect of like, bringing together people who can sort of explain what happens to words and why they change and how they are adopted. And then there are people like me or like Ben Zimmer or other people that are really amazing at tracing the etymological history of words and their growth or change in newspapers and magazines and online. And I think that like just that bringing all of that together is just so interesting to me. It's like why I mean part of the reason I wanted to write this book is that like I just love like trying to understand what happens in language from a very journalistic perspective, just like simply like, oh yeah, I mean, I have a section in the book where I write about the evolution of the word redskin because I'm a sports writer and like I
Yeah.
worked for Slate for a long time, which actually banned the use of the Washington football team's name way before um, the conversation sort of reached that critical point where the team ended up changing its name. So it was something I'd thought about for a long time. I was like, okay, I'm going to go back and research that because this is really interesting stuff. And that's why I love, Word of the Year allows you to sort of take words both obscure and popular and new and old and run them through the sort of linguistic, machine, the sausage machine, so we can understand why they're important, how they became important, and what they mean and how they've changed.
In other words, how the sausage gets made.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So I kind of turn to AI. Like, there's it's like boring, honestly, now for me to have in some ways discourse about AI because it's like, well, um, it's just we're oversaturated with discussion of AI and algorithmic methods. But I one of my favorite quotes in the whole book reads, "The dictionary projects permanence, but the language is jello, slippery and mutable and forever collapsing on itself. The dictionary projects ubiquity, but even the best AI hasn't figured out how to collect and define every collectible and definable word." So, our language is wobbly and subject to institutional censorship and politicization, and it's imploding upon itself, but then rising again from the ruins of its implosion. And that's all fascinating and in some ways to a linguist a little bit self-evident, but it's really important because like how does AI challenge that or like accelerate that process? Why is AI unable to collect and define every collectible and definable word? I'm curious about that. But then how, sort of, yeah, where do dictionaries go from here?
That's the big question. I mean, why can't AI do this yet? I mean, it's pretty good. I have a whole chapter about AI in the book. And I did what everybody does. I sort of ran I asked AI to define words that I had written about, and words that hadn't emerged yet, and words that were sort of occurrent, and tried to see what it came up with. And I do my own sort of little forensic analysis, my amateur forensic analysis that I shared with linguists to get sort of their feedback on. Um, and you know, AI is only good, of course. I'm not saying anything that you don't know or anybody doesn't know, but AI is only as good as what goes in, what it scoops up and what it steals. And it's not going to be able to steal everything because word creation is so organic and so nonstop that it's still not a competent system for collecting and analyzing. And the definitions that AI can produce in a really sort of very basic lexicographical sense aren't bad. I mean, they work.
Yeah.
Um, but where are they getting them? I also found that like when I asked a couple of words to when I, in a couple of instances, they were pretty much verbatim. I think I asked it to come up with a Merriam-Webster style definition for microaggression, and it basically spit back what I had written.
Mhm.
So it was just, regurgitating what it had stolen from Merriam. And that's especially relevant because Merriam and its parent company, Britannica, just filed a lawsuit against the AI company Perplexity for stealing their data. Um, so, can AI write a dictionary? Yeah. I mean, I talked to people, academics, who said, like, look, AI can write a dictionary right now. And it has done that with specialty dictionaries. I mean, in Europe, where lexicography is much more of an academic subject than it is in the United States, that's been going on. People are trying or asking AI to write dictionaries. It's happening already. Do I think that like it's going to kill Merriam-Webster or that Merriam one day will just turn over lexicography to bots? I mean, I guess it's possible, right? But ultimately, I do think that you still need humans and that humans are better analysts or better parsers, better deconstructors of language and meaning, at least for now, than AI is. And there's also part of me that's just nostalgic. Like this is a craft that evolved over centuries, and we've lost trust in institutions. And John Morse, the publisher of Merriam-Webster, told me that that could be an explanation for why dictionaries sort of bit the dust in the 90s and 2000s. People don't need them anymore. People don't trust anymore. So I think there's an argument to be made that building and maintaining a business that people can trust and demonstrating to the public that this is an essential product and an essential process is really important to society.
Yeah.
And, AI can be an enhancer of that. I'm sure there are going to be new uses for it that will make sense in lexicography. And we just don't know what those are yet.
For sure. And I think, something that I have been thinking about a lot is like maybe the best question about AI is not whether or not it is good generalizably, but rather where is it good and where is it best suited to kind of do or substitute human labor.
Right.
Like, the, yeah, I I have interviewed a lot of people on this podcast that are very, very, very critical of AI, like sort of overall. And I disagree with like a lot of generalizing, just like AI is bad claims. Um, I've interviewed a few people that are pro AI, but I mean,
Hmm.
but again, like the people that are pro AI are much more specific about it. They have to be like, like if you're pro AI, you really have to be specific about like where and why I'd want to use this. And so like totally, but there are many ways in which like I'm sure AI will be useful to dictionaries and to the process of compiling, creating dictionaries, but might not be the only thing that we ever use
Right.
going
And it
forward.
might
Yeah,
not be the most basic thing that you would think of, like writing the definition. It might
hmm
be creating a corpus. It might
totally.
be assembling sample quotations. There may be other, unknown ways that it'll be useful. I know that Merriam and Britannica were working on a project to use AI to develop a thesaurus bot that can answer questions. So there's going to be ways, particularly ways that might enhance the business of a company like Merriam-Webster. Maybe not the end result, who's writing the definition and who's editing it and who's preparing it in CMS for publication online, but for these other ancillary things that will help enhance the business to keep a company like Merriam-Webster in business.
One more thing. I mean, the idea that I want to just repeat again that you feel nostalgic for like these older methods and kind of way of doing that. And throughout the book, that was just very clear. Like you met so many characters throughout. Like I mean, the book is so well written, but you go on all these different journeys and you go to like an apartment in New York, where this kind of like heiress has been collecting these like dictionaries and thesauruses and kind of like books of slang and like obscure vernacular of different communities and your boss at Miriam, like all these different people that are just so deeply passionate about this and they take this so seriously. And it goes back to that quote at the beginning, is like seeing yourself as like the neutral arbiter of
Hmm.
language rather than viewing it politically. And I think that that's really hard to do and honestly like pretty close to impossible, but like you manage and people do care deeply about it and I guess like yeah, I'm sympathetic to the idea that there's something real to that nostalgia and like imperative about protecting like what we've done for forever.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I loved the most in being at Merriam-Webster was just being at Merriam-Webster. I mean,
Totally.
the building was constructed in 1940. Hasn't been renovated much since. The company really hasn't thrown out very much. There is a charm to the 16 million slips of paper stuffed into filing cabinets on the editorial floor that were the source, the lifeblood of the creation of Merriam's dictionaries, pretty much, for the entire 20th century. Um, and and the hours I spent sort of like wandering around the basement. There's like a dungeon where they saved almost all the books that were used to create Webster's Third in the 1940s and 50s, leading to the publication in 1961 of Webster's Third. And just like you just pull open a drawer and it's like you'll find something super fascinating. I mean, and that's where we have found like all kinds of interesting stuff. Like Ben Zimmer
Who was on the
and
podcast? Who
who's
was
been
on
on the podcast,
who's
I'm
on the
sure.
podcast? Yes.
Ben and Peter Sokolowski and Lindsay Rose Russell have been essential to the our understanding of this little piece of Merriam history, which is how the word fuck was removed from the galleys of Webster's Third before publication. And the reason they're central to it is because they kind of randomly came across these papers in Merriam's files. I mean, I have a chapter about slurs in the book that relied heavily on a filing cabinet in the Merriam basement with a drawer labeled N-word squaw. And it was just like stuffed with correspondence and and angry letters from people about slurs. Um, so there's a romance, at least for me, in these little slips of paper that Merriam has collected and used to create these dictionaries over the years. I mean, I do write a chapter about the paper and what it means in the history of language. My favorite, like the thing I often come back to when I think about like being at Merriam is like you go through the drawers and they look like, card catalog drawers with little 3x5 index cards, slips of paper. Um, Merriam, they have different color names, whites and pinks and blues at
Yeah.
Merriam, and they all have a different purpose. And what I really love about them is like you can sort of track the history of like the 20th century by looking at the cards, both like the handwriting that people had in like, 1910 or 20, or how typewriters evolved, or how photocopying evolved. You get the sort of the white on black photostatic reproductions that were stuck onto the quotation slips and put in Merriam's files. So like all of that sort of tells a story. And the loss is that, we lose the ability to know that history if we get rid of it and if we rely strictly on, digital databases. I mean, I mentioned Corey Stamper earlier. She's got a new book coming out about the language of color. And that, she decided to write that book because she like rescued a bunch of folders that were about to be thrown out from like an old desk or something at Merriam. Who knows how many more stories like that are still inside this building? And I think it is kind of a historical shame that we've lost the citation slips from other dictionaries, for prominent dictionaries from the 20th century. I mean, Merriam has this repository, like belongs in, if not the Smithsonian, or in its own museum. But who's going to pay for a museum of lexicography? It's not going to be, today's National Endowment for the Humanities. Um, so there's a risk there, and I think it's kind of sad. Like I also went to Oxford and looked at their, 100 years of paper, and it's just so charming. And at least I had the ability to, I think, tell a few stories about this stuff and why it matters and what makes it interesting. And that's my own little way of maybe preserving this slice of linguistic history.
Yeah, and I think there's something too about like lexical items in particular being like lexical items in particular indexing history in a way that like other evolutions in language don't. And so like, when you talk about sort of different words of the year, like you can see historical moments jumping out at you. Like to Pluto was a word of the year once, right?
Right.
Which is not something we say, but oh right, Pluto did get demoted.
Right.
Bush lips, like totally.
I mean, I lived through both of those, and I swear to God, I have no idea. I have no memory of those being like lexically interesting or intense, but whatever.
Right, right. But then you look at the words that didn't win, and you're like, oh God, wow. Like then that's still around, right?
Right.
Riz never won.
Right.
It was still around, right? So yeah, there's just something about like lexical histories of lexical items that is just particularly fascinating. Okay, so Stefan Fatsis, first off, I just want to say thank you so much for writing this book. Like, such a pleasure to read. Thank you for quoting me in it. Crazy that I found out through a friend who texted me and said, Talia, you're quoted in Stefan Fatsis's book. I said, what? I emailed you. You said, yes, indeed, I was, and I'm coming on your podcast. I said, yes, of course you are.
Huh?
Of course. But anyway, so Stefan, if you could tell me, what was your favorite word that you discovered in the process of writing this book?
I'm going to give you a two-part answer here. Like my favorite word that led me in down like a lexicographic rabbit hole was one that the director of defining at Merriam, when we were sitting in the room where I would go with him to get tutored on lexicography. He like typed in a word into the unabridged website and turned it around and showed the computer to me, and it was pom pom girl, and he said, "Look at this." And the definition in the unabridged was pickup prostitute. It was like, what? Like, what? And so I asked him, like, could I like take a crack at this? This was like really early in my defining career. It was like, okay, I need something that I can like go down a gigantic rabbit hole that is totally weird and unexpected and would give me the opportunity to learn to write a definition. And I did like literally like weeks of database diving and research and writing, and all of my work, by the way, not enshrined in any dictionary because the Unabridged project got shut down, and
Mhm.
pom pom girl not a high priority word to be revised. So it still says pick up prostitute on the Merriam website. But the history is really interesting for this word and how that came to be its main definition in the Unabridged Dictionary in 1961. And the explanation is that the old way of defining words was flawed. Like
Mm.
definers, editors at Merriam-Webster relied on the citations that they collected from newspapers and magazines and other sources. And if you went to define Pom Pom Girl and all you saw in the citations were two or three cards from World War II, which is the derivation of the prostitute sense of the word, then that's what you had to go on. So it was a sort of an interesting for me like revelation about like, oh, that's why this process is so flawed. That would never happen today, right? Because I can call up, 1,000 examples of the use of Pom Pom Girl in print and online. I don't have that problem of relying on what somebody else happened to or didn't read in a magazine in the hour or two a day that they were collecting examples to put into the citation files. My second word, and this is nice because I think we can talk a little bit about something we haven't talked about so far. I love my favorite Noah Webster word is soup, SOOP. And Noah Webster, and I didn't know much about this before I started working on the book, as part of Noah Webster's language reform in the early 1800s, he advocated for changing the spellings of words to make them more logical, like, getting rid of RE endings, getting rid of OU in like color,
Right.
and doing other simplifications like that. Um, and I think soup is just so much fun for me because it's like it looks so weird, SOOP. And there are lots of words that Webster included in his 1806 dictionary, his first effort, the Compendious Dictionary, but then sort of smartly took out of the 1828, his main dictionary, the one that led to his immortality. But a few of those did manage to stick around, and he did affect great change on language. And so I write about the history of Noah and the early dictionaries and the rise of the Merriam brothers, who bought the page proofs to Noah's books after he died.
Yeah, and if I may share kind of my favorite like
Go ahead.
word-ish that I discovered, definition that I discovered while reading this book, but in the first sort of like opening chapter of the book, you say that in the 1828 dictionary, Webster's second sense of people was the vulgar, the mass of illiterate persons.
Yeah.
And I found that great.
Yeah.
And now it's not, I guess.
Yeah.
But
I
also,
mean,
sorry, go ahead.
no, I was going to say Webster was a total snob, but he
Totally.
also got stuff right.
Stefan Fatsis, thank you so much for coming on.
Talia, thank you so much for having me on and for what you're doing. This is amazing. You do great work. You're a wonderful person. I can't wait to see what you accomplish.
Thank you. That really does mean a lot. Thank you so much. Cool. Okay. So now that that's out of the way, you're the best. This was awesome. Thank you for not making my life super hard and the fact that this was like actually so fun to read.
I'm so
Oh
glad you
my
liked it.
God. Could you
Seriously,
imagine
I'm
if it
so glad
wasn't?
you
I'm
liked it.
kidding.
Oh my God. Go.